There is a specific kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from working too hard. It comes from holding something together that has already decided to fall apart. You know the feeling, not the tiredness of a long week, the deeper kind. The kind that lives behind your eyes when you wake up at 3 a.m. and the ceiling offers no answers. The kind that makes familiar rooms feel like someone else's life. The kind that sits in your chest during conversations you used to find meaningful and now find hollow. Not because the people changed, but because you are no longer the person who found them meaningful. Something is ending. And here is what nobody tells you about that. The moment right before a real identity shift, not a mood, not a phase, not a rough patch, but a genuine structural transformation of who you are, feels almost identical to the moment right before something simply breaks and doesn't recover. The pressure is the same, the silence is the same, the sense that the ground beneath your assumptions is no longer solid, identical, which raises a question that most people spend enormous energy trying not to ask. What if the disintegration is not the problem? What if the collapse of the self you've been performing for the last 2, 3, or 4 decades isn't a failure of will, or a sign that you chose wrong, or evidence that something in you is fundamentally broken, but is instead the only mechanism through which the next version of you can actually arrive? Not a consolation, a structural fact. Because here is the paradox that this entire video will sit inside: the universe. And by that we mean the totality of circumstances, pressures, relationships, and internal contradictions that constitute your actual life, does not test you when you are comfortable. It tests you at the exact threshold where your current identity can no longer contain what you are becoming. And the test is never what it appears to be. It doesn't look like a test of strength. It looks like a test of survival. It doesn't look like an invitation. It looks like an ending. It doesn't feel like transformation approaching. It feels like destruction arriving. That confusion is not accidental. There is something precise happening in that confusion, something that initiatory traditions across every major civilization understood, that modern neuroscience is now beginning to map, and that most of us at 45, 50, 55, or 60 years old are living through without a frame that makes any of it legible. That frame is what we're building here. Not to make the process easier, not to give you a technique, but to give you something rarer and more useful, a way of seeing what is actually happening when the floor drops out and everything you used to call yourself starts behaving like something you're watching from a distance. Here is where we start. You are not falling apart. You are being asked a question. And the question is not, do you have what it takes to survive? The real question, the one your life has been building toward with uncomfortable patience, is this: which version of you is willing to stop being protected long enough to become real? We're going to take that question apart slowly, and when we come back to it at the end, and we will come back to it, it will mean something entirely different than it does right now. That difference is the point. Let's begin with a problem that philosophy has been circling for roughly 25 centuries, and that psychology only recently got precise enough to name properly. Identity, the experience of being a continuous, coherent someone, is not a thing you have. It is a thing you maintain, and maintaining it requires constant, largely unconscious work. William James, the American psychologist, who essentially invented the modern science of the self before neuroscience had the tools to confirm what he was seeing, described identity as fundamentally a process of selective attention. A continuous act of choosing what to include in the story of you and what to quietly discard. You are not remembering your life, you are editing it. Every morning, without deciding to, you reassemble the same character, same values, same grievances, same ambitions worn smooth by repetition, same version of why things happened the way they did. The self is less a noun and more a verb, a constant negotiation between what you experienced and what the story you're telling about yourself can afford to include. This is not a flaw. It is, for most of a human life, an extraordinary adaptation, until it isn't. Because here is what the philosophical tradition from Heraclitus through Hegel to the contemporary cognitive scientist Lisa Feldman Barrett all converge on, through radically different vocabularies. The self is a predictive structure. It doesn't perceive reality directly. It generates a model of reality and then it perceives the model. The brain, as Barrett's research makes clear, is not a passive receiver of experience. It is an active prediction machine, constantly generating expectations about what the world should look like, and then updating, or, crucially, refusing to update when those expectations are violated. Which means identity, at its deepest level, is a set of predictions about who you are, how the world responds to you, and what is possible for someone like you. Predictions, not facts. And predictions can become obsolete. Here is where the philosophical problem sharpens into something personal. When the circumstances of your life shift significantly enough, when a career ends or transforms beyond recognition, when a relationship tells you a truth you can no longer unknow, when the body begins refusing the terms it previously agreed to, when the children leave and the house echoes differently, when you reach the age your parents were when you first thought of them as old. The predictive model that constitutes your identity begins generating errors, not small errors, structural ones. The world stops confirming the self you assembled, and the self, being a prediction machine, interprets this not as "I need a new model," but as "something is catastrophically wrong." This is the precise origin of the experience people describe as feeling lost, feeling unmoored, feeling like a stranger in their own life. It is not weakness. It is not pathology. It is the experience of a coherent identity system encountering data it cannot integrate without fundamentally restructuring itself. Why does the mind always interpret expansion as threat? Because expansion, at the level of identity, requires the demolition of existing structure before new structure can be built. And the existing structure, your current self, does not experience its own necessary dissolution as growth. It experiences it as annihilation, not expansion, erasure. And it responds accordingly, with resistance, with grief, with the desperate, exhausting work of trying to hold the old model together against mounting evidence that it no longer fits. This is not a spiritual metaphor. This is a description of what your nervous system actually does when identity is under structural pressure. The philosopher Charles Taylor, in his work on what he called moral frameworks, the invisible background structures that tell us what matters, what is worth doing, and who we are in relation to others, argued that a crisis of identity is never merely personal. It is always a crisis of the framework that made the previous self possible. When the framework collapses, the self built on it doesn't just feel threatened, it feels like it is disappearing. Because it is, not into nothing, into what comes next. But here is the limitation of everything we've said so far. Knowing the mechanism doesn't change the experience of it. You can understand, intellectually, that what you're going through is structural rather than catastrophic, and still feel in the 3 a.m. darkness, like something irreversible and terrible is happening. The crisis isn't the problem, it's the signal. The question that carries us into the next section is, a signal toward what? Because the answer to that requires us to stop looking inward for a moment and look backward, far backward, into the architecture that human beings built across every civilization, specifically to survive what you are living through right now. Every civilization that survived long enough to leave records built something around this moment, not around success, not around achievement, around the threshold. The word initiation comes from the Latin initiare, to begin. But what the initiatory traditions of Egypt, Greece, West Africa, the indigenous Americas, and the ancient Near East all understood, with a precision that we have largely lost and are only now recovering through the lens of developmental psychology and neuroscience, is that a true beginning requires a prior ending that is not metaphorical. It has to actually cost something. The anthropologist Arnold van Gennep, writing in 1909, was the first Western scholar to map what he called rites of passage, ritualized transitions that moved an individual from one social and psychological identity to another. He identified 3 phases that appeared with remarkable consistency across cultures that had never been in contact with each other: separation, liminality, incorporation. First, the individual is removed from their existing identity structure, stripped of their name, their role, their possessions, their social position. Not symbolically, literally. The old self is formally ended. Then comes the middle phase, which Van Gennep named from the Latin word limen, meaning threshold. The person in transition exists between identities, no longer who they were, not yet who they will become. This phase is deliberately disorienting, often terrifying. The individual is held in structured uncertainty until something internal shifts. Victor Turner, who extended Van Gennep's work across decades of fieldwork in the 1960s, called this middle state communitas, a dissolution of ordinary social structure that paradoxically produces the most intense experience of connection and meaning. The person in the liminal phase is simultaneously at their most vulnerable and their most receptive. The old categories have collapsed. New ones have not yet formed. This is the most dangerous and the most generative moment in a human life. And here is what the traditions universally agreed on, what every elder and every initiatory guide across these cultures understood as axiomatic. You cannot rush the threshold. You cannot skip the liminal phase. You cannot meditate your way around it, reason your way through it, or perform your way past it. The dissolution is not incidental to the transformation. It is the transformation. The identity that will emerge on the other side cannot be built on top of the old one. It can only be built from its materials after the old structure comes down. The ancients didn't try to skip the dark. They built architecture around it. Now consider what modernity did with this knowledge. We kept the language, transformation, breakthrough, reinvention, and quietly removed the dissolution. We turned the initiatory journey into a weekend workshop. We replaced the threshold with a technique. We marketed the arrival without acknowledging the necessary destruction of what existed before. And we left entire generations navigating genuine initiatory crises without any framework for what those crises mean or what they are actually asking for. The result is that millions of people, particularly in the second half of life, are experiencing precisely what the traditions designed their most elaborate rituals to hold, and they are experiencing it alone, without context, interpreting structural transformation as personal failure. What if the confusion itself is part of the design? Because here is where the neuroscience enters, and where the ancient intuition finds its modern confirmation. The psychiatrist and neuroscientist Daniel Siegel, working on what he calls interpersonal neurobiology, the study of how relationships and lived experience shape the physical architecture of the brain, has documented something that the initiatory traditions appear to have known intuitively. Genuine psychological transformation requires a period of what he terms integration through differentiation. The brain must first allow existing neural networks, the physical substrate of identity, of habitual thought, of the predictive models we discussed earlier, to destabilize before new, more complex configurations can form. This process is not comfortable. It produces exactly the symptoms that people in midlife transitions report: disorientation, loss of motivation, flattening of meaning, a strange grief that has no clear object, the persistent sense that something is deeply wrong without any ability to name what it is. Those are not symptoms of breakdown. They are symptoms of rewiring. There is a concept in complexity theory called the edge of chaos, the narrow band of conditions that exists between rigid order and complete disorder. It is precisely at this edge, researchers have found, that the most complex and adaptive systems reorganize themselves, not in stability, not in collapse, in the unstable territory between the two. Your nervous system, your identity, your entire psychological architecture operates by the same principle. The edge of chaos is not a malfunction. It is the condition under which genuine reorganization becomes possible. The Sufi poet Rumi encoded this understanding 8 centuries ago with an image so precise it functions almost as a neuroscientific diagram. The reed cut from the reed bed, crying from separation, producing music precisely because of the hollow that the separation created, not despite the wound, because of it. The hollow is not damage, the hollow is the instrument. And then there is Jung. Carl Gustav Jung spent the second half of his career, beginning notably with his own catastrophic psychological dissolution in his late 30s and early 40s, which he later called his confrontation with the unconscious, developing what he observed to be a consistent pattern in the lives of people who underwent genuine transformation after midlife. He called the overall process individuation, from the Latin individuare, meaning to make undivided, to become whole. But the critical insight, the one that gets consistently softened in popular retellings of his work, is this: individuation does not begin with expansion. It begins with the collapse of the persona. The persona, Jung's term for the social mask, the performed self, the identity built for function and acceptance rather than truth, must first become visibly inadequate before the deeper self can assert itself. And the mechanism through which the persona becomes inadequate is almost always external pressure that the existing identity cannot metabolize. In other words, the test, not delivered by a benevolent universe that has your best interests at heart in any simple sense, delivered by the accumulated weight of everything you have not yet become pressing against the container of everything you currently are. The container cracks. That cracking feels like failure. It is, in fact, the first evidence of growth since childhood. Think about what that means for a moment. Most of us, after a certain age, stopped growing in the way that children grow, visibly, structurally, in ways that require us to completely revise our understanding of ourselves and our place in the world. We optimized instead. We refined. We became more efficient versions of an identity that was essentially set by our mid-30s, and we called that maturity. But the psyche does not stop pressing. The unlived life does not stop accumulating. And at some point, for many people it is somewhere in the corridor between 45 and 60, the pressure of what has not been lived becomes greater than the energy required to maintain the performed self. That is when the test arrives, not as punishment, as invitation. But here is the limitation that carries us forward. Knowing that the traditions mapped this, knowing that the neuroscience confirms it, knowing that Jung named it and Rumi sang it, none of that tells you what it actually feels like when it is your life, your career, your marriage, your body, your specific and irreplaceable existence that is being asked to restructure itself at an age when everything in the culture around you is suggesting that the major transformations are behind you. That is where we go next, because this is the place where most philosophical content loses you, where it stays elevated and clean while your actual life sits in a different register entirely, messier and more ambiguous and considerably less poetic than a Rumi verse. So let's talk about what the threshold actually looks like at 45 or 52 or 61. It rarely announces itself clearly. It almost never arrives as a single dramatic event. More often it arrives as the accumulation of signals that you have been expertly trained by decades of functional living to interpret as problems to be solved rather than messages to be read. The career that no longer fits is perhaps the most common signal and the most consistently misread one. Not the career that became difficult. Difficulty is normal and navigable. The career that became alien, where you find yourself sitting in meetings that you once led with genuine energy, now watching yourself perform competence from a slight distance, as if you are an actor who has memorized lines for a role that was written for someone younger or hungrier, or simply for an earlier version of you that no longer exists in any meaningful sense. You are still good at it. That is almost the worst part, because if you were failing, the decision would be obvious. But you are succeeding at something that no longer corresponds to anything alive inside you, and the success itself has become a kind of trap, a set of golden handcuffs made not of money, but of identity. This is who I am. This is what I built. This is the evidence that I matter. And somewhere beneath that, quieter and more threatening, if I let this go, what is left? That question is not a career question. It is an identity question wearing a career question's clothing. Then there is the relationship that tells the truth, not necessarily ending, not necessarily broken in any dramatic sense, but somewhere in the architecture of a long partnership, 10 years, 20 years, 30, a conversation begins happening that doesn't use words. a distance that wasn't there before, or that was always there but both of you were too busy or too careful to acknowledge. Try a moment when you look at the person across the table from you and recognize with a clarity that feels almost violent that you have both been loyal to a version of each other that neither of you still fully are. This is not betrayal. This is what happens when two people grow, separately, asynchronously, in directions that the relationship's original architecture didn't anticipate. The relationship is not failing. It is being asked to expand. But expansion, as we have established, first presents itself as threat, and so the distance becomes charged, the silences become loaded, and both people interpret a threshold as a wall. The details are different, the geometry is identical, and then the body. At a certain age, the body stops being a vehicle you operate and starts being a conversation you are required to have. It does this not with cruelty, but with a precision that once you stop resisting it, is almost philosophical in its clarity. The knee that protests the run you used to take without thinking. The recovery time that now asks for respect instead of permission. The face in the mirror that insists on its history whether you have made peace with that history or not. Most people treat this as loss. Pure and uncomplicated subtraction. But there is another way to read it. And this is not the consolation version, not the your body is a temple reframe that asks you to feel grateful for things that are genuinely difficult. It is a more structural observation. The body, in the second half of life, begins insisting on presence in a way that it didn't when it was functioning smoothly in the background. It demands attention. It demands renegotiation. It forces a relationship with limitation that younger bodies simply don't require. And limitation, when you stop fighting it long enough to examine it, has a way of clarifying what actually matters. What does the pressure in your life right now keep pointing at? Because here is the pattern, and it holds across every version of the threshold. The career, the relationship, the body, the friendship that has outgrown its original terms, the spiritual practice that once felt alive and now feels like furniture. The pressure always points at the same place, not at what you should do next, at what you have been unwilling to become. The threshold is not asking you to solve a problem. It is asking you to stop solving the wrong one. The wrong problem is always some version of, how do I restore what I had? The right problem, the one that pressure is actually pointing at, is always some version of, what needs to be true about who I am for the next chapter of my life to be possible? These are not the same question, and the energy required to keep answering the first one is precisely the energy that would otherwise be available for the second. There is a particular exhaustion that belongs to this phase specifically, not the exhaustion of overwork, as we said at the beginning, the exhaustion of a person who is simultaneously maintaining an identity that no longer fits and resisting the one that is trying to emerge. Both efforts running in parallel around the clock, consuming energy at a rate that no amount of sleep or vacation or strategic self-care can adequately replenish, because you cannot rest your way out of an identity crisis. You can only move through it, and moving through it requires something that the first half of life rarely demanded with this kind of directness: the willingness to grieve what you are leaving rather than simply escaping it or replacing it as quickly as possible with something new. The career, the relationship dynamic, the version of your body, the self-concept that organized your 30s and 40s, these are not mistakes to be corrected. They were real. They served something real. They deserve to be ended with the same seriousness with which they were built. Not drama, seriousness. The difference between those two things is significant. Drama is loud and performs for an audience. Seriousness is quiet and performs for no one. It is the private acknowledgement that something that mattered is ending, and that the ending itself deserves to be witnessed by you, if by no one else. This is what the initiatory traditions understood that we have largely forgotten. The ending must be honored before the beginning can be real. You cannot skip the funeral and go straight to the rebirth. The psyche will not allow it. What is not properly ended simply continues underground, shaping the new chapter from below, ensuring that the new identity is built on the same foundation as the old one, which means it will encounter the same pressures, generate the same errors, produce the same crisis, perhaps in a different costume but structurally identical. You can change everything external and remain at the deepest level unchanged. Most people who find themselves at 55, wondering why a second marriage feels eerily similar to the first, or why a new career carries the same specific weight as the one they left, or why a different city somehow produces the same interior landscape. Most of those people did not fail to change. They changed everything except the self that was doing the changing. That is the trap, and naming it is not the same as escaping it. Because here is where we hit the real edge of this block, the limitation that points us toward what comes next. You can name what is happening. You can recognize the signals. You can map the threshold with everything we've discussed, the neuroscience, the initiatory framework, the Jungian lens, the specific textures of your career and your relationships, and your body talking back to you. And still in the middle of it, the most natural and human response in the world is to want it to stop. Not to understand it, to stop it. And here is what that desire, completely understandable, completely human, consistently misses about the nature of what is actually happening. The test is not asking for endurance. It is asking for something far more specific, far more difficult and far more interesting than simply surviving the pressure. And that is exactly where we go next. Here is the thing about the test that changes everything once you see it clearly. The universe, the circumstances, the pressure, the accumulated weight of your unlived life pressing against your current identity is not measuring how much you can bear. It is waiting to see which self survives, not which self is strongest, not which self is most disciplined or most spiritual or most psychologically sophisticated, which self is most true. Which version of you, when everything that can be stripped away has been stripped away, remains standing not because it fought hardest, but because it was the only one that was actually real in the first place. This is the distinction that changes the entire frame. Because if the test is about endurance, then the correct response is to harden, to develop thicker skin, stronger boundaries, better coping mechanisms, a more resilient psychology. The self that wins an endurance test is the self that can suffer the longest without breaking. But if the test is about coherence, about which self remains coherent under pressure, then hardening is precisely the wrong response. A harder version of a false self is still a false self. It is just more expensive to maintain and more difficult to eventually release. The correct response to a coherence test is not hardness, it is honesty. Not the performed honesty of public vulnerability, where you share carefully selected struggles in carefully managed contexts in order to be seen as someone who is courageously honest. The other kind. The private, unglamorous, often deeply uncomfortable honesty of sitting with yourself long enough to notice which parts of your current identity you are defending because they are genuinely true, and which parts you are defending simply because you have been them for so long that releasing them feels like self-destruction. Those are not the same thing. And the pressure of the threshold has one primary function: to make the difference between them impossible to ignore. What are you defending that you no longer actually believe? Take a moment with that question, not as a rhetorical device, but as a genuine diagnostic. Because most people, when they sit with it honestly, discover that the answer is more extensive than they expected. A set of values inherited rather than chosen, maintained out of loyalty to a younger self who adopted them under conditions that no longer exist. A self-concept assembled from other people's responses to you, from what was praised, what was rewarded, what kept the peace, rather than from anything you deliberately constructed. A story about what your life means that made perfect sense at 35, and now at 50 or 55, requires increasingly elaborate maintenance to keep coherent. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur made a distinction that is useful here between what he called idem identity and ipse identity. Idem, from the Latin for same, refers to the identity of sameness, the self that persists through time by remaining consistent, predictable, recognizable. Ipse, from the Latin for self, refers to the identity of selfhood, the self that persists through time by remaining faithful to its own deepest nature, even when that nature requires visible change. The idem self survives by staying the same. The ipse self survives by staying true. And the crisis of the threshold, at its most essential, is the collision between those two kinds of survival. Every identity collapse is also an identity selection. The pressure does not destroy randomly. It destroys selectively, targeting with remarkable precision the constructions that were never genuinely yours, the adaptations that served a context that no longer exists, the performances that were always costing more than they returned. What survives the pressure, and something always survives, this is critical, is not what was strongest. It is what was most fundamentally you, beneath the layers of function and approval and carefully managed presentation. This is the center of everything. The test is not asking, can you endure this? The test is asking, when everything constructed is stripped away, who is actually there? And the reason the test feels like destruction is that, from the perspective of the constructed self, the item identity, the persona, the predictive model, it is destruction. Genuine and complete, the constructed self does not survive the threshold intact. It cannot. That is the point. What survives is something older and less articulate, and considerably less impressive to the outside world, at least initially. It does not arrive with a polished narrative or a clear 5-year plan. It arrives with something quieter and more fundamental, a sense of what is actually true for you, independent of what was expected of you. That arrival is rarely dramatic. It is, in fact, often anticlimactic in the extreme, which is one of the reasons people miss it, or dismiss it, or keep waiting for a more convincing version. It tends to feel less like revelation and more like recognition, less like discovering something new, and more like remembering something you always knew but had been systematically too busy, too functional, too well constructed to acknowledge. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius, writing to himself in private notebooks that were never intended for publication, documents so raw and honest that they read almost like therapy sessions conducted in the middle of the night, returned again and again to a single question that he never seemed to fully resolve. What is the thing that I am, underneath what I am required to be? He was, at the time of writing, the most powerful man in the known world, and he was, by his own account, uncertain in a way that his power could not resolve, confronting a version of the same threshold that has nothing to do with circumstance and everything to do with the gap between the self that is performed and the self that is actually present. Power did not exempt him from the test. Success did not exempt him. Wisdom did not exempt H. The threshold does not check your credentials before it arrives. And here is what Marcus understood, at least on his clearest nights, that most of us spend decades avoiding the self that is actually present. The ipsum self, the one beneath the performance, does not need to be constructed. It needs to be uncovered. And the uncovering is not a gentle process. It requires the removal of everything that was placed on top of it, layer by layer, decade by decade, beginning in childhood when you first learned which version of you was acceptable and which was not. The test strips those layers. Not kindly, not on a schedule that respects your plans, and not with any guarantee that the timing will be convenient. But here is what complexity theory, Jungian psychology, Marcus Aurelius, the initiatory traditions, and every person who has genuinely moved through a threshold rather than around it all agree on from their radically different vantage points. The pressure is not random, it is precise. It targets exactly what needs to go, no more and critically, no less. The aspects of your identity that survive the threshold are not lucky survivors. They are the ones that were structurally sound to begin with, the ones that were genuinely yours. And they emerge from the pressure not diminished but clarified, the way a stone emerges from a river, not broken by the water, but shaped by it into something more essentially itself, not destroyed, revealed. There is one more dimension to this that almost never gets named, and it is perhaps the most important thing in this entire video, so stay with it. The threshold does not only select for the true self, it selects for the self that is capable of the next chapter. And the next chapter, the one waiting on the other side of the dissolution, is not available to the identity you currently have, not because you are inadequate, because the next chapter requires a different relationship with uncertainty, with limitation, with other people, with time itself, than the identity you built in the first half of your life was designed to maintain. The first half identity is, by necessity, a consolidating identity. It gathers credentials, relationships, resources, self-concept, a coherent narrative of who you are and where you are going. This consolidation is not vanity. It is necessary. You cannot build a life without it. But a consolidating identity, by its very nature, defends what it has gathered. It protects the investment. It interprets change as risk and dissolution as loss. And this orientation, essential for building, becomes a direct obstacle to what the second half of life actually requires, which is not more accumulation, but a fundamentally different relationship with what already exists. The Jungian analyst James Hollis, who spent decades working with people navigating exactly this transition, described the task of the second half of life not as achievement, but as meaning. Not what you can build, but what your existence actually stands for at the level that no external achievement can either provide or take away. That task cannot be completed by the first half identity, not because the first half identity is wrong, but because it is oriented in the wrong direction. It is looking outward for confirmation. The second half task requires looking inward for truth. The test is the mechanism of reorientation. It is not punishing the first half identity for its limitations. It is creating the conditions under which those limitations become visible enough and costly enough that the reorientation becomes not just possible, but necessary. This resolves the question of why now. Why the threshold arrives when it does, in the decade it does, with the specific pressures it carries. Not because the universe is cruel and not because you failed to do the work earlier, because this is precisely the moment in a human life when the consolidating project has reached its natural completion and the meaning project is ready to begin. And the transition between them cannot happen without the dissolution of what made the first project possible. The pressure doesn't destroy you. It reveals what you were always going to become. But there is one thing the threshold demands that almost nobody warns you about. One specific requirement that is neither strength nor wisdom nor spiritual sophistication. It is simpler than all of those and considerably more difficult. And that is where we go now, and not into more explanation, but into the room where you actually live. I want to step out of the framework for a moment. Not because the framework isn't useful. It is. But because there is a specific kind of person watching this video, and that person does not need more framework right now. They need to be seen. You have probably spent a significant portion of your adult life being competent. Reliably, visibly, sometimes exhaustingly competent. You are the person people call when something needs to be handled. You are the person who figures it out, who holds things together, who shows up, who delivers. And that competence has been, for most of your life, the primary language through which you have expressed your value, to your family, to your work, to yourself. And now something is happening that competence cannot fix. That specific experience, the experience of a genuinely capable person encountering a problem that their capability cannot resolve, is one of the most disorienting things a human being can go through. Not because the problem is too large, because the tool that has always worked is the wrong tool for this particular job, and there is no obvious replacement tool. And nobody in your immediate life who is used to you being the capable one knows quite how to hold the version of you that is uncertain. So you have probably been managing it, keeping it contained, performing a version of yourself that is slightly more functional than you actually feel. Because the alternative, letting the people who depend on you see the full extent of what is happening internally, feels irresponsible or frightening, or like a door that, once opened, might not close again. That containment is costing you more than you are admitting. And here is what I want to say directly, without the buffer of historical reference or neuroscientific framing. You are not failing the test. You are not behind. You are not doing it wrong. The exhaustion you feel is not evidence of weakness. It is evidence of how long you have been carrying something that was never meant to be carried alone, in silence, without context, without anyone naming what it actually is. The one thing the threshold demands that nobody warns you about is not courage. Courage is available to you. You have demonstrated it repeatedly across decades of a life that required it. It is not wisdom. It is not surrender in any passive or defeated sense. It is permission. Permission that you have to give yourself because no one else has the authority to give it to you. Permission to not know for a period of time exactly who you are becoming. Permission to be in the middle of something without having resolved it. Permission to let the old self be genuinely over without rushing to replace it with a new one before the new one is actually ready. The initiatory traditions held the person in the liminal space, the threshold, for as long as the process required. Not for as long as was comfortable, not for as long as was socially convenient, for as long as was necessary. And they surrounded that person with the collective understanding that what was happening was not breakdown, but becoming. You are not surrounded by that collective understanding. Most of you are navigating this in the middle of ordinary life. The meetings still happen, the bills still arrive, the people who need you still need you, without a single person in your immediate environment who has a name for what you are going through. This video is not that community. It cannot be. But it can offer something smaller and still useful, the recognition that what you are experiencing has a structure, has a history, has been survived and even, eventually, valued by every human being who has moved through it honestly. You are not broken. You are between. And being between is not a problem to be solved. It is a process to be moved through, with as much honesty and as little performance as you can manage on any given day. Not perfectly, not efficiently, just honestly. That shift, from performing the process to simply being in it, is in practice what the permission looks like. And it is also, though it may not feel like it yet, the moment the test begins to change its character. You're not failing the test. You've been answering the wrong question. And now with that on the table, we can finally close what we opened at the beginning. We started with a feeling, the specific exhaustion of holding something together that has already decided to fall apart. The 3 a.m. ceiling, the hollow conversations, the familiar room that feels like someone else's life. We started there because that is where most people actually are when they find something like this. Not in a moment of inspiration, but in a moment of quiet desperation dressed up as ordinary Tuesday. And we asked a question that we deliberately left open. What if the disintegration is not the problem? We can close that now. The disintegration is not the problem. It is the process. And the process has a shape, not a comfortable shape, not a shape that fits neatly into a life that still has obligations and relationships and a mortgage and people who need you to be functional, but a shape nonetheless. Separation, liminality, incorporation, dissolution, reorganization, emergence. The edge of chaos held long enough for new complexity to form. The reed cut from the reed bed, crying its specific music because of the hollow, not despite it. Every frame we moved through, the neuroscience of predictive identity, the anthropology of initiation, the philosophy of the threshold, the Jungian understanding of individuation, the Stoic confrontation with the performed self, pointed at the same thing from a different angle. The test is not a test of what you can endure. It is a test of what is actually real in you, and what is real in you cannot be destroyed by the test. It can only be revealed by it. This is not optimism. This is not a reframe designed to make difficulty more palatable. It is a structural observation about how identity transformation works, confirmed across traditions and disciplines and centuries of human beings moving through exactly what you are moving through now. The self that is being tested is not the self that will survive. The self that survives is the one that was always there, underneath the one being tested. Quieter, less defended, more essentially yours than anything you deliberately constructed, and it has been waiting, not passively but with the particular patience of something that knows it is inevitable, for the constructed self to exhaust itself sufficiently to stop blocking the view. That is the payoff, not triumph, not arrival at a new and better identity that you can present to the world as evidence of your successful transformation. The payoff is simpler and more durable than that. It is the experience of being, for perhaps the first time since childhood, genuinely yourself, not performing a version of yourself that was calibrated for approval or function or the management of other people's expectations, but actually quietly, unmistakably yourself, in a way that requires no maintenance because it is not a construction. That experience does not announce itself. It tends to arrive sideways, in ordinary moments. A conversation where you say what you actually think and notice that the sky doesn't fall. A decision that you make from the inside out rather than from the outside in, and that feels less like achievement and more like recognition. A morning where the exhaustion is simply gone, not because your circumstances have resolved, but because you have stopped spending energy on the maintenance of something that no longer needs to be maintained. The old self wasn't wrong. It was temporary. And temporary is not a failure condition. Everything that served a genuine purpose in its time deserves to be honored as it ends, not mourned as if its ending erases its meaning. The career that carried you through 20 years of building something real. The version of yourself in that relationship that loved with what you had available at the time. The identity that held things together when things needed to be held together. These were real. Their ending does not retroactively unmake them. But they are ending. Or they have ended. And the fact that you are still here, still watching, still willing to sit with a question this uncomfortable for this long, that is not nothing. That is, in fact, the most significant data point in this entire video. The person who has already given up on this question does not ask it. The person who is genuinely lost does not go looking for a map, even an imperfect one. The fact of the search is evidence of the searcher. And the searcher, not the constructed self, not the performed identity, not the competent and reliable person that everyone else depends on, but the part of you that is still genuinely curious about what comes next. That is precisely the self that survives the threshold. Not the one who had all the answers, the one who kept asking. Which brings us back, finally, to the question we opened with. The one we said would mean something different by the time we return to it. Which version of you is willing to stop being protected long enough to become real? Here is what that question actually means, now that we have the full context to hold it properly. It is not asking you to be reckless. It is not asking you to abandon your responsibilities or perform some dramatic act of self-reinvention that announces to the world that you have undergone a transformation. It is not asking you to leave or to stay or to make any specific external decision at all. It is asking something interior, something quiet, something that happens not in the action but in the orientation behind the action. It is asking whether you are willing to stop spending your primary energy on the defense of a self that the pressure of your life has already revealed to be incomplete, and redirect that energy, even a small fraction of it, toward the honest investigation of what is actually true for you now at this age, in this life, with everything you have lived and everything you have not yet lived, pressing against each other in the specific and unrepeatable way that constitutes your existence. That investigation does not require a retreat. It does not require a therapist, though a good one can help. It does not require leaving your life in any external sense. It requires only the willingness to stop lying to yourself about what you already know. You already know which parts of your current life belong to the next chapter and which belong to the one that is ending. You already know the difference between the exhaustion of genuine effort and the exhaustion of performing a self that no longer fits. You already know what the pressure in your life is pointing at, if you are willing to read the pointing without immediately trying to make it stop. You have always known. The test was never designed to inform you of something you didn't know. It was designed to make what you already knew impossible to continue ignoring. That is what it means to be tested at the threshold of an identity shift, not examined from the outside, clarified from within. And the clarification, when it comes, not as lightning but as the slow, unglamorous, irreversible recognition of what is actually true, is the shift itself. Not the dramatic before and after that the culture sells as transformation. The quiet, interior reorientation that changes not what you do first, but how you relate to yourself while you do it. From the outside, almost nothing may look different. From the inside, everything is. The universe did not test you to break you. It tested you to find out who you actually are. And now, apparently, so did you. If something in this landed, not as information but as recognition, as the specific feeling of hearing something named that you had been carrying without language, then the most useful thing you can do right now is not subscribe, not share, not follow any particular instruction. It is to sit with it for a moment before you move to the next thing, because the movement to the next thing, the reflexive, habitual forward motion that fills every gap before it can become an opening, is precisely the mechanism the threshold is asking you to interrupt. Sit with it. And if you want to continue the conversation, there is a video here that goes directly into what the second half of life actually asks of you, not as philosophy, but as practice. The link is on screen. One comment worth leaving if you're willing, not what you think about this, what you recognized. That distinction matters more than it sounds. The shift has already begun.